As an adaptation practitioner, she has supported the coordination and development of national and regional adaptation initiatives, ranging from policies to community-based adaptation initiatives. She is the founder of the Young People for Action on Climate Change in Jamaica, YPAC Jamaica, which is working on building a climate justice youth coalition in the Caribbean. And she's also founded Girls Care, Girls for Climate Action for Resilience and Empowerment, which offers mentorship for girls in climate activism. And of course, that's just a summary of all that Aisha has been up to. We won't get to every single thing that our panelists are engaged in, because then that would take us to the very end of the session. Next up, we have online with us from Barbados, Lisa Purge, who is the managing director, founder, and practice manager of a woman-led social impact enterprise called Sadie Consulting, based in Barbados. She has more than 25 years in international development, working for more than 20 years on environmental management issues. She's provided technical expertise at national, regional, and international levels, including research to inform policy and decision-making processes from a social and gender perspective. So she also is a member of the Caribbean Action Learning Group on the Green Economy, Advancing Women in Development, AWID, and serves on the Advisory Council of the Society of Gender Professionals. And so closer to home now, well, here at home, we have Derval Bazi. Derval is the host of the Climate Conscious podcast, which is an independent communication platform aimed at increasing public awareness and amplifying the Caribbean perspective of climate action and sustainable development. Derval is a sustainable development professional. I'm sure you can figure that out, with 13 years of experience working at the nexus of energy and climate. She's provided risk management support in the oil and gas sector, as well as in sustainable energy policy and project development in government and intergovernment organizations. And finally, also from Trinidad and Tobago, we have with us Charlotte Tom, who is a dedicated advocate bridging the realms of the environment and society, passionate about bridging the gap between climate science, policy, and action. She's working toward cultivating a Caribbean rooted in sustainability and social inclusion through communication, integration, and action. Charlotte works to support private and public institutions to embed sustainability into policies and strategies. I should mention that her experience ranges from projects related to climate resilient policy development, gender-based analysis, reporting for UNFCCC compliance, integrating ESG principles in corporate entities, and education and awareness of issues within the Caribbean. So I think without any further ado, good afternoon, ladies, and welcome to you all.
Good afternoon, Nadine. Thanks for the intro.
Of course, hi, my pleasure to be joined by you all this afternoon. I think it seems we don't have yet everyone with us, but I'm sure they'll be joining us very shortly. We'll start, of course, with a definition of the concept of intersectionality, which I believe is often associated with gender discourses. But of course, when we talk about intersectionality in general, it has become a kind of catch-all for all things to do with the various bases of inequality in the world. So Derval, why don't we start with you? Give us your take on what intersectionality means, particularly in the context of climate change.
Thank you, Ardeen. To me, when we're talking about intersectionality, it's especially in the context of climate change, it's understanding that it's never just one issue. And at every level, it's actually a web of many issues. It's multifaceted. And in order to address climate risk and impact in a meaningful way, we have to acknowledge that climate change is in fact multifaceted, and we have to be intentional about making those connections with every aspect of our lives as individuals, as communities, as a region, especially where there are existing inequalities. Because one thing about climate change is that it amplifies inequalities. So if you've been paying attention to international climate change discussions, you know that the conversation is dominated by what we call the global north. And for that reason, it's very important for us as Caribbean people, experts, advocates, activists, to tell our own stories so that we bring out those nuances or the unique context of our local environment as individuals, but also as a community. And telling our stories, not just about the crisis, but also our stories of recovery and resilience, so that our culture and our lived experience can be centered.
Absolutely. Thank you for making that point, because that's one of the things I think we ought to keep front and center of a conference like this that is really catering to Caribbean Gen Zers. That is our audience. And so the conversation really always ought to be centered here, well, as far as possible. Lisa, we're very happy to have you with us. Welcome. Good afternoon.
Thank you, Ardeen. Good afternoon, everyone.
Okay, Lisa, so we're just doing a round robin here to get a sense of what intersectionality means to you in the context of the work that you're doing in the realm of climate change.
Okay, and I assume that means that you want me to say something now.
Yes, that would be nice.
Awesome. Hi, everyone. So I caught the end of Derval's contribution, and good afternoon to the rest of the speakers, and thank you so much to the organizers. So in the work that we do at Society Consulting, intersectionality comes up almost every day, and it means many things, but I think key for us is the way in which people live lives that are multiply impacted, not just by climate change, but by where they live, the kind of livelihoods they have, and what that even means for how often their income is generated and in what form. It's about their race, their ethnicity. It's also about, whether they are reliant on one source of income or the other. Sometimes it can be influenced by religious and linked religious cultural practices. It could also be about their ability or disability. Certainly gender and gender identity fits in there as well. But it also is about the way at which we interact with the environment at different levels, economically, socially, and as persons who aesthetically and also use natural resources. And so for us, it comes in a complex but wonderful bag of many things and many issues that make persons' experiences unique, but then also actually part of a broader picture and a pattern. And so often we work with issues that are touching on the needs of farmers and fisher folk. And then you can get into fantastic issues like, if you are working informally or in a sector where there's a lot of informality, for example, how do you ensure that you address issues of income to be able to invest in adaptation? And that brings in issues of national insurance, for example. And so to me, I think of intersectionality as a house with many windows and many doors. And depending on which one you open, you can find lots of very interesting surprises that then lead to the next room.
And which, of course, all complicate the issue of climate change. I mean, they complicate it generally, yes?
But it does complicate it, but it actually also makes it, to me, maybe I'm just strange that way, but it also makes it also makes it simple, because in many ways, some of these issues are very simple and very practical.
Okay, well, we'll definitely have an opportunity to get into that. Aisha, thank you for joining us. We're happy to have you here. We're just doing a round robin, getting a sense of intersectionality and what that looks like to everybody, and especially in your own sphere in Jamaica.
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity, and my sentiments of thanks as well to the organizers and for the space to share and learn. I don't think there's much else to add to what Lisa and Derval have so eloquently said. I'll simply add, though, that in the work that we do at Girls Care and in the other streams of work in which I'm involved, intersectionality is a part of the process or an approach that we adopt, as well as an outcome that we try to work towards in the work that we're doing. It's really for us to understand that the ways in which we work have to consider the multiplicity of experiences and identities and issues that people encounter with. We often say people don't live single issue lives, bearing that in mind at all times, centering that, validating that in the work that we do, and also in terms of the outcomes, ensuring that, the end products of the work that we do benefit all, So again, addressing the varied perspectives, experiences, backgrounds that the range of communities and individuals that we serve come with. And I think more of late, it's more readily acknowledged as and seen as not just about the people. We talk about people and intersecting identities and ideals of people, but no, I think we can also more readily see examples of the ways in which climate change as an issue is intersecting on different sectors and different, elements of our society. We talk about trade, we talk about tourism, we talk about agriculture. Sadly, I think there are much more practical and tangible examples of those intersections that we can more readily, identify and really are substantiating the claims that scientists and practitioners have long been making about the fact that climate change will impact every facet of our existence as human beings.
Thank you for that very comprehensive response, Aisha. Charlotte, do you have anything? I'm sure you have something you would like to add, especially with your recent foray into the private sector. I'm sure there's something you can teach us about that.
Yes, thanks, Adine. I just want to say hi and afternoon to everyone. I had some trouble there with my camera in the beginning, but I think I sorted it out. Yeah, I really liked a lot of the areas that you guys touched on. Durval, a word that really stuck out to me that you said is you think of it like a web almost. And I think, at the roots of intersectionality, what that means to me is really understanding the complexities, the intricacies, and the nuances that exist in the systems that we live in society, and kind of how those things can work together or work to reinforce different systems. For example, in my experience working in the private sector, as you were talking about, Adine, I really related to what Aisha was talking about in terms of, a lot of times in the work that I do, we are not speaking directly to persons in the climate space. It's more climate adjacent, or look at working with companies or different sectors such as trade, tourism, all which really intersect very heavily with climate, right? So it's kind of really, to me, about making those connections and kind of broadening the scope in how you view an issue, taking a more kind of holistic whole of system approach, right? Because it's gonna affect, it's not an issue by itself in a vacuum. When we talk about like sustainability or climate change, it kind of ties into every facet of our lives and everybody's sector, everybody's job. And so it's really about finding and making those connections, and that's going to help make more effective solutions,
I want to jump into the question of how we communicate that. And that came up in the session earlier with Kalain as well. He focused a lot on, as a scientist, how you relay that information to GenPub. And in the case of now adding the different layers, as we've been describing, getting into the different windows of the house, Lisa, how do we tailor these messages now to meet the different populations and also to get people to understand how different groups are being affected differently? Mm-hmm. How do we even begin to tailor the communications around intersectionality? Charlotte?
Okay, I was wondering if that was addressed to me. But yeah, it's kind of continuing on my previous thoughts, which is something that I have kind of been learning and like continuously learning as my career kind of progresses, and I kind of explore bubbles outside of the environmental science and climate science bubble. I think it's really important to step back and understand that, of course, we all think this is the most pressing issue. I personally do. But also understanding the perspective and background that everyone else is coming from, right? Regardless of depending on whether it's a country or whether it's from a national priority level or from a company business level, right? So I think what I've been learning is really important to kind of learn those different languages in how to communicate, and kind of play to different interests. Not everyone, as I've been learning the hard truths as I grew up in my career, but not everyone is really gonna jump at the word climate change and sustainability, sometimes quite the opposite. But they might jump at when you talk about their bottom line or how it might affect the goals of their organization or the priorities of their sector, right? So I think, in broadening your scope and kind of taking that intersectional approach in how we think and take on issues can, enable us to be a more effective communicator and probably reach and touch more people to get them kind of on board.
And Deval, I imagine that as a host of a podcast that explores a lot of these different issues, you have some experience in addressing the question of intersectionality and communicating that. What have you learned along the way?
Thanks, Ardeen. Definitely it has been a key feature of the work that I do with the podcast, because as we've all been discussing, it intersects with so many other areas. So it's impossible to just address a siloed issue. So definitely it's important to help make those connections, help persons make those connections. And as Charlotte mentioned, often relating it to something that they can actually appreciate, definitely the bottom line. And in my work, it's always important to highlight that climate change is not only an environmental issue. It's an economic issue. It's definitely a social issue. And when you start making those connections, it can seem overwhelming. It can become like a giant. But I always say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? So it's definitely important to understand all the connections, have an awareness, not necessarily trying to be an expert in all those different areas. But if you are aware that all of these layers are important to consider, even if you choose a particular area to focus on, which each episode of the podcast focuses on one aspect of climate change. But it's impossible to discuss, let's say, agriculture without bringing in some elements of maybe gender or economy or communities. It's impossible to just talk about the energy transition without talking about, upskilling, reskilling, gender as well, and always bringing in the Caribbean context, because we know that our lived experience is different. So definitely it has been a main feature of the work that I do, and I think it makes it even more interesting. And there's a space for everyone in the climate change discussion. It's no longer just for the scientists or the environmentalists or even certain policymakers, but we need our doctors to be mindful of climate change, as we have been experiencing these extreme weather events, heat waves. So we need our engineers to be mindful of climate resilience. We need our policymakers, our economists to be mindful of gender issues. So to me, it can be overwhelming, but at the same time, it can be exciting, where there is a point of entry for everyone into the climate change discussion.
Thank you, Deval. Lisa, I get the impression that your career has taken you through all walks of life. I mean, especially at the policy level. And I imagine there is a particular conundrum for people operating at the policy level, trying to meet the need or satisfy, or at least appear to satisfy the needs of everyone. What has been your experience about taking that intersectional approach at that policy making level in the Caribbean?
Thanks, Ardeen, for giving me these very nice, tough questions. Well, I think, how do you tackle the policy level? So it comes from two angles. You think about how policy needs to serve the needs of those who are in greatest need. The policy needs to serve general needs, and in some ways also needs to take a risk management approach to prevent other people from becoming needy. And then you also need to address the understanding, the capacity and the drive of the policymaker to be able to accept the policy, approve the policy, and then them and the technical people to implement the policy. So I think it's important to break it down in that way, because there are these different angles that come into that whole process. In doing so, it can be important to understand where all of these people are coming from and their experiences. And that's where data, research, stakeholder interviews, reviewing past research becomes very important. But also it's important to kind of see what's happening. And so sometimes it's also important to see what's coming up in the newspaper. What are the issues that are popping up, that are being reported on? What are the incidences that are being reported on, particularly from a human perspective? What are people, saying is affecting them? And understanding perhaps therefore what is driving that. A critical element of it is also seeing how, for example, the issue we're talking about, climate change, fits within the context of what seems to be the broader discussions in terms of what's driving the macroeconomy or not driving it, and what things can affect it. And, so as we think now, we're sitting in hurricane season, it's September, and, we always say September to remember, and we're hoping we don't have a lot to remember this year, but that's what we say. And so far for September, we've had one category 3-4 hurricane, thankfully that well elsewhere. And we've got Lee coming up that could be in that way. So part of it is really just trying to ground what it is we're talking about as an issue of climate change, and not only what are the things that are affecting us now, but what are the things we're not seeing that is driving, and what does it mean for our future? And having some very real conversations, because sometimes persons have seen it, but they don't necessarily call it climate change. And sometimes people have not really made the connection to something like climate change. It's a lot of negotiation. It's a lot of conversations, and it will be compromise because it's hard to make everybody happy to the same extent, but you do want to make sure that everybody's covered to some extent in that process. And that hopefully you have also an operational plan. I think a key thing that I've learned is it's also important to really kind of identify, like in a hub and spoke kind of way, what are those hubs? What are those entry points that, if you do them well, will actually respond to the needs of multiple people? Because often we don't have the capacity, we don't have the time, we don't have the money to take every single individual on. That's impossible. So we have to find those creative entry points that allow you to be able to tackle something like, say, agriculture. If you do agriculture, you touch on food security. It's hard to do one without the other. You are going to touch on issues of water. You are going to touch on issues of energy. You are going to talk about issues of health, because when you're talking about food security, you're also going to be talking about nutritional security. And so agriculture becomes one of those spaces where, by looking at it and dealing with it, you can actually bring in a whole group of people, deal with a multiplicity of issues, and also tackle some structural issues, particularly on a gender perspective. And that includes who has access to land, why don't they have access to land, what quality of land they have access to, what kind of resources can they get, and so what position are they in to even invest in their own resilience or to invest in adaptation. If they can't even do that, or that they don't have the time to do it, then putting a climate policy out there and saying that they have to do it is a bit tricky, will be the polite way I would put it.
Well, thanks a lot for addressing that question of agriculture that came forward as well from one of the participants. I'm assuming you saw it.
I did. So that's why I said, let me try to weave it in there.
That's great. I wanted to ask, I think there's a significant, on the part of a number of us in the Caribbean, we get the impression that Barbados is slightly ahead because you have the rock star prime minister of the region championing this cause on the world stage. Do you think that positions the work that you do and people like you, civil society, etc., are you better positioned, do you think, than those of us working in countries where our leaders are yet to really get it? Lisa?
That's still for me, I guess. So I work in a funny space, you see. So I work technically in the private sector, but tend to do a lot of nonprofit work on the side or interweaved in that. So there are benefits to having a prime minister who is bringing out some of these fundamental structural issues, particularly about the global economy and what that means for how small and developing states manage their resources, and about some of the issues of equity and justice within the context of that. That doesn't necessarily always peer down in a direct way to the work that I do very specifically, because I'm working in a very specific space of gender and environment, gender, climate, gender, natural resources. It does, but it doesn't always get to that level. And so the opportunity for me is to take that visioning that is structural, which is great for any gender discussion, and to be able to weave that into the work that I do, to be able to make the link between what that's talking about and the burning issues that I may be talking about, either at a household level or a sectoral level, or even a macroeconomic level. It provides me with an opportunity to add to what is being said by our rock star prime minister, putting some very human face kind of broader social and cultural norms aspects to that, and dealing with some other nexus issues. I think one of the things that we've discovered, or we keep talking about, is recognizing that everybody intends to do well when they do climate adaptation work, but we must not be naive that transitions don't come without a cost. Anytime you transition a person from one livelihood to the next, or even make shifts within that livelihood, there are going to be costs. The cost is usually borne by that person. That person already doesn't have the money or even the time. And so we need to be well aware of the fact that transitions are costly, that there is social and economic displacement. And we need to do a better job actually of making sure that as we plan and we budget, which is where Rockstar Prime Minister becomes a really important element, to make sure that that budgeting brings that into consideration. We do a lot of, and I used to be involved in a lot of projects, and I will tell you that a lot of projects just ignored the fact that there was a transition cost that was there. There was a displacement effect that occurred, even temporary or medium term, and there was no budget to manage it.
Thank you for that, Lisa. I think that really drives the point home for all of us across the Caribbean when we think about the implications of those transitions. Aisha, you work at a very interesting intersection of gender and youth. And Lisa pointed to the question of transition and the implications and possible risks and fallouts associated with those transitions. How do you feel young people how are they responding to that message? I mean, do you get the impression that they feel that it's an onerous task for them to have to consider their futures in the context of transitions? Or is there a kind of excitement as well, you think, around the possibility of creating something different and new?
Yeah, it definitely is multifaceted in terms of the responses and the perspectives that youth share on this matter. I think for one, there's a sense of this, intergenerational inequity and injustice as a result of the burden that youth now have to solve this crisis that they did not create, very much in line with the North-South injustice of the issue. And so there is apathy, I believe, on the part of some young people. Why should I bother with this issue, with investing time and effort into this, especially because a lot of the work, young people are the face of the movements and the advocacy and the agitation and the lobbies. And a lot of that work is unpaid. And so there's this absence of remuneration and acknowledgement of the time, energy, and effort that goes into the work that young people are leading, but yet still this expectation that they will continue to do that. And thankfully, there are those young people who continue to show up and show up, exceeding expectations of some persons in the space, because the young people also have their fingers on the pulse of technology and innovation and are using, those skill sets to come up with solutions and come up with interventions that are better placed to respond to the crisis in some instances. I think especially in the global South, young people, there's a little bit of reticence on the part of some, but for the most part, in the spaces that I occupy, thankfully, and I don't want to make it seem as though it is the preoccupation of all young people, because that is also a lie. There is a cadre of young people who are very much invested in this. It's a passion issue, it's very personal, and so they're making lots of sacrifices of time and other, assets and resources to do this work. And then there is the large majority who are somewhat interested, somewhat knowledgeable, but don't care enough to take it on. I also often say that climate advocacy is a luxury. You need at least internet connection, you need at least some amount of time, you need at least another source of income to be able to do this, and so it's unfair of us to think that those young people who are not making this the mainstay of their daily conversations or advocacy don't care. the realities that a lot of them have very basic day-to-day survival bread and butter issues that they're having to contend with. And so, in the instances where those of us are better equipped and better resourced to do that, then we must also see that as part of the advocacy that we do on behalf of our peers. I mean, I think therein lies the essence of intersectionality, understanding the disparities and the nuances of the demographic of which we speak, that allows some young people to be able to better occupy these spaces and access the resources necessary to do this work, and those who cannot for whatever reason. And again, young people, not a homogeneous group, we have them coming with different lived experiences, different sociocultural backgrounds. As I believe we talked earlier about the messaging, and Jerval spoke about that. A big part of the struggle is that some people still don't believe it happening. A big part of it is that you still have some young people who are very steeped in religious beliefs that say that it is a God-induced phenomenon and it's blasphemous to do anything, to try and combat climate change. So those realities also, I believe, are helping to shape the ways in which young people are engaging with the issue in the region.
And I mean, it would be great to get a sense from all of you who are connected to those youth spaces, the Gen Zers who are tuning into this conversation, to give a sense of how you feel young people are showing up for their peers who are not able to be in this space, who are not able to be as active, and who just don't have access because they have other priorities. And economically, socially, etc., there are barriers. Culturally, you identified religion being one, but there are barriers to an active participation and even a kind of informing oneself about these issues. So how do you see young people now, who, like yourselves, many of you, who are at the fore of this, how are you all sort of applying that intersectionality so that you can build more of a community among different types of young people? Charlotte, Duval, feel
start
free
by
to jump in.
sharing that for example, Derval and the work that Derval does, and the work of some of the feminist groups across the Caribbean, women-led organizations, Lisa, people who are part of my network. Charlotte, happy to meet you. I think and Charlotte said it earlier too, like for those of us who are in this space and completely just immersed in it, like we think that everybody is as excited about it as we, or everybody is as invested in this. And sometimes it takes stepping back from it a whole lot to recognize that there's a whole other world outside the climate change space, even though we recognize, again, the web effect and the intersections with all of the issues. But the work that, these organizations, my organization, does is really premised on the recognition that it's a case of survival of the fittest, survival of the richest, and it's a case of if we don't do what we have to do right now, then all of us will burn or drown, because the world is already on fire. We talked earlier about the language. It has shifted from global warming to global boiling. But, how many people really taking all of that into consideration? I think the fact is that we continue to do what, at least I'll speak for what myself and Girls Care and YPAC, we continue to do what we do based on the observations or the knowledge that we have of what is at stake, this responsibility that I think I have with the resources, the knowledge I have to do more, to do good, to do as much as I can for not just current generations, but future generations. And I'll share a little bit about more recent work. And I think it speaks to the question earlier about communication as well. Girls Care recently wrapped up a project that was focused on training young women to use photography as a tool to document climate adaptation and resilience. And these are young women who are creatives. So it was a way for us to bring creatives into the conversation frontally. So they otherwise, probably would have just been hearing about what's happening in climate change and environmental work broadly, but this brought them into the neck of the work. And it was so powerful and transformative on a personal level for them, but also in terms of elevating and escalating messages of their communities and households to policymakers. So one story, for example, looked at Rastafarian photographer, young woman. She documented climate change impacts in a Rastafarian village commune in Jamaica. And she told that story at our exhibition. And what I found most kind of mind-blowing was that one of the leading policymakers on climate in Jamaica from the Planning Institute of Jamaica, at the end of that presentation, got up and said, we did a whole national adaptation plan concept for food security, and we didn't think about the Rastafarian and their specific needs and plant-based diet and what that might mean. And so for me, it was a powerful way to translate a message from the ground to the, very often we think about how do we simplify the messages from policymakers and scientists. But in this case, it reminded me that very often we need to also consider how do we take the messages from these people who are living on the front lines in these, very simple language and elevate it to a point where policymakers see the need to really confront that in policy decision making,
But that also requires us to be very connected. And I think sometimes that's the issue, because the Caribbean is plagued by issues of class. I think every country can talk about their experience of class and the reality of class and how that affects how it affects work like this, social work. And when we're talking about issues like climate change that seem very intimidating because of the science and all of that, it seems to provide an opportunity for widening the gap. So, Lisa, I'm interested in hearing from you again because of the diversity of experience you've had working in Barbados and I believe other parts of the region, how you see us bridging that particular gap of economics.
This is, I think, one of our perennial challenges. I mean, I think it depends on, so I think I will say this a lot, depends on which level of the economics we're talking about. Are we talking about the macroeconomy? Are we talking about, table and dish kind of economy where we're talking about household budgets? Are we talking about sectors which are trying to think about their long-term survival? And so I think that the economic discussion is an important one because climate finance, for better or for worse, is a very topical issue. And it's critical because for small and developing states, we certainly cannot fund our adaptation or resilience by ourselves. Our economies and the scale at which we generate GDP and our national income just will not be able to cover that. And so that's one element of it, and the Bridgetown Initiative, and also some of the broader discussions around climate finance and justice within that, including gender justice, and then also the Loss and Damage Fund, are part of an effort to really try to address some aspects of the economic nature of the issue we're dealing with. And that's going to be important, not just for us, but in terms of what the work that we're doing now will mean for those who will pick up and who are already picking up this baton and running with it, and what they will actually have also in the future potentially to support this. But I think it's also important to look at the other end of that scale, which is about the individual and the household, in terms of how they are going to start to look at managing their own economics, their household economics, where they're investing their resources. And so, for example, in work that we're doing, when we've been looking at the transition to energy, so whether you're looking at bioenergy possibilities or even just a just transition to energy and access to solar, for example, LEDs, etc., we've recognized that there is a need for a deeper and broader conversation about what that will mean in terms of the affordability of these technologies, and not just the first part of the cost, but issues of maintenance and replacement. And if you look at certain within our economies and you look at how our labor market works, we still have a rather significant proportion of persons who are either in low or a middle level employment in terms of what they generate. We have people who are working informally, or we have people who are working in sectors that are seasonal and highly impacted on climate change. So I come back to farmers or fishers because for me, they're very visual, very easy for people to see and understand what we're talking about. And if we're talking about their ability to be able to deal with the individual and household level transitions that come with climate change, it will mean that they're going to have some level of either individual savings, or they're going to have to look at forms of collective savings and be able to manage their resources in that way, to have kind of like a rainy day fund, if you will. And that's going to be an economic issue because they're going to have to make decisions about what they can invest in now, whether it's education, clothes, other things to do with the house, as well as dealing with these realities. But it also means that we need to think about how we can support and protect their incomes, which we know are very fragile. I mean, I think the lessons of COVID-19 were very clear. They should still be in our minds. They were drastic. We really started to understand the extent to which, employment can be full-time, could look long-term, but it can also be extremely fragile. And therefore, it can be blown away. And so I think these two angles of the issue require us to really look at, different levels of how the state exists and will provide a certain level of protection and safety net, but also how individuals will also need to invest in their own resilience and their own, self-reliance, because that's going to be key. The state can't do everything and people can't do everything for themselves.
Yeah, and I think it's really about community. I mean, that is a word that comes back to me oftentimes
Yes.
when we have this conversation. I mean, what you're talking about, coming together, pooling resources, I think that really is the only way. That's just my personal view. But Durval, you wanted to contribute to this line of the conversation, or in fact, because we are close to time, I was actually hoping to get you, Durval, and Charlotte to talk a little bit about some of the opportunities, because I think we've not exhausted, but we've certainly touched on quite a few of the risks and implications for various groups of people who may be left out of this conversation for whatever reason. But what are the opportunities you see in this discourse and in the developments that have to take place here on?
Hi, so listening to this morning's keynote, Dr. Len Ishmael said two things that really stood out to me, and I think are that are relevant to our discussion here today. And one of the things was, you don't need a big platform, and I can attest to that. And the other thing is, she said, to be persuasive, one must understand and respect the other point of view. And I think those are two good principles that anyone, but especially Gen Zs that are interested in advocacy and activism, should take note of and reflect on. So, using the podcast as an example, I started with no training in this, no fancy equipment. I just wanted to, I saw a gap in terms of persons who are not directly involved in this field, not understanding the connections. And I use conversations, interviews to help illustrate those connections, highlight the issues, but also solutions. It doesn't have to be a podcast, but it's, find some points that you are passionate about and have influence in your community. It may be just in your household, it may be a group of friends, but as I said earlier, there is a point of entry for everyone. And then in terms of understanding and respecting the point of view, I think there's a need for balance in our advocacy. And as a quick example, if we use the energy sector, we know that it's a big contributor to climate change, and it's also one of the big solutions for climate mitigation. And I often hear people say that we should go 100% to renewables. But what does that mean for an energy producing country, for example, Trinidad and Tobago? What does that mean for our economy that is based on, well, right now, natural gas, but we have a over 100-year history of fossil fuel production? What does that mean for the employees, the workers that are trained and skilled in these specialized areas? And what does it mean for the communities that are supported, their economic activities are supported by these industries? And then,
Well, thank you very much. I'm sorry,
yes.
we're going to have to just go to Charlotte quickly. I know we are
Okay.
getting ready to get to the breakout rooms by 2 p.m. So Charlotte, I want to give you the opportunity to weigh in on the opportunities in this movement, and especially
sure.
for Gen Zers.
Sure. Just also kind of touch a bit on what Durval was saying. I think that's something that stuck out a lot to me there, was being able to identify and recognize unique context. So like, for example, our unique Trinidad context, what the solutions that work for Barbados is not going to be the same as Jamaica, St. Lucia, etc. And I think in recognizing that, it kind of opens the door for a lot more opportunities. We're very quick to look outside of our region to see what we could mimic and mirror, but on our own soils, there's so much opportunity there. Going more to the, I guess, activism or advocacy space. Another topic that Aisha spoke a bit about was the importance of story sharing. And this is something that I can't emphasize enough. In the Caribbean, we, not just the Caribbean, but there's typically that issue of lack of data, right? And I think it's one thing to discuss, to sit here and talk about intersectionality and what that means, right? But sometimes, and I guess a decision-making position, they're not always understanding that context, so they aren't actually able to like qualify and quantify what is actually happening on the ground. And I think this is where kind of expanding those narratives and sharing those stories like through podcasts, for example, or through different art forms, like Aisha said, photography. I think that's really how we bring voices like to the forefront and make those connections. Lastly, in terms of opportunities, I think over the past few years, I graduated in 2019, and coming out of university with an environmental degree, I felt initially very lost at first in terms of how the job market was looking. It was very difficult to find entry-level jobs. And then COVID happened, et cetera, et cetera. But just in those like 3-4 years, I've seen such growth in the sector and the opportunities. And I think this is because of the intersectional nature of climate change, right? Because it's not just a sector in itself now. It's every industry you look at now, they're looking for some sort of sustainability experts or climate risk expert to kind of integrate that perspective, because it's becoming essential and mandatory in some cases, right? So I think that's definitely something I wanna leave, I guess, fellow young people with is that that hope for the opportunities that are coming up, and also reminding yourself to kind of take a whole of self approach and see what other areas, passions, interests that you can also bring to the space, and as well as how you could bring space to those other areas and interests and passions.
Thank you all very much. I know we don't have, in fact, we're over time already for sure, but I'll just ask each of you, please, to leave one resource, one guiding resource with our viewers, participants, conference participants right now. Lisa, let's start with you.
Thank you so much, Ardeen. There's so many, but as I was thinking about, someone whose work I try to follow occasionally, not all the time, but I thought of Kumi Naidoo, who I think is South African, and really does bring to the table a very important perspective of issues of justice and linked in, I think, to issues of colonialism and global power structures. But I find that he's able to bring those issues to the discussion on climate, not necessarily from a gender perspective, but I like the way that he kind of brings the issues down. And then, there are a couple of other elements that we've tried ourselves to break those down in our own podcast. So colleagues can go there and hear us talking about gender and money. So, when you raised economy, I smiled because we do believe that, you can't get away from the money question. And so we
Lisa,
do
would
have
you mind
some
just
podcasts.
Yes, putting the name in the chat, please,
Sure,
to everyone,
I will.
so they can actually
Sure.
get the name of the author as well as the podcast. Aisha?
Okay, sure.
I'll very biasly speak of Girls Care, and I'll send you to the Girls Care IG page. I think we do an excellent job of bringing actors and activists from the global south, not just the Caribbean, into shared spaces. And there are bios and other information that you can use from our page to connect with some of these great activists and resource persons. And also I'd like to mention a podcast that is led by a colleague of mine, Dana Lynn Swaby. It's a climate justice podcast that we have curated under our Building a Climate Justice Coalition for Youth Caribbean initiative. And that also is a space where we have centered Indigenous voices around climate justice in the region. So really invite you to look at those resources.
And I invite you to put those in the chat as well, so folks can check it out. Durval? Of course, the Climate Conscious podcast, number 1.
Yes. So in addition to the Climate Conscious podcast, I would really like persons to check out a TED Talk by Alyssa Amor Gibbons, an architectural designer from Barbados, who delivered a TED Talk to a global community that speaks to climate resilience built environment for the Caribbean. So I will share the link in the chat. And I think it's important for us to, as I said before, tell our stories, not only from a place of crisis, but from a place of hope and strength.
Thank you so much for that, Duval. And Charlotte, you'll take us out with your recommendations.
Also, another TED Talk by a Nigerian writer called Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. And she's very well known for her work on feminist movement and race politics. But a specific TED Talk she did, which actually I think is one of the most viewed TED Talks, is called The Danger of a Single Story. And
Yes,
I think
very
that
well.
whole
Yes.
metaphor of a single story is, quite the opposite of what we talk about when we talk about intersectionality. And, even though it doesn't directly relate to she doesn't talk about climate change specifically, but I think she does a really good job at kind of contextualizing some of those issues and how we think about the systems that we live in. I'll put her name in the chat here.
Yes, fantastic. Thank you so very much, all of you, all our panelists today, Duval, Charlotte, Lisa, and Aisha, for your contributions, for, of course, your work, your contribution to the space and to this space at the Climate Gen Z conference. Folks, we are wrapping up now and heading over to the boot camp. So we ask you to stick around for the first one, which is International Climate Policy with a Caribbean Lens. You don't want to miss that. And of course, directly after that, we'll be going to climate science with a focus on the Caribbean. These are boot camps and workshops for this afternoon. Thank you all. Have a good one.
Bye. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thanks,
for the
Ardeen.
Sure. My
Thanks,
pleasure.
Ardeen.
Bye.